On our vacation, she whispered, "I met someone who makes me feel alive. We're done." I didn't argue. Those words still echo in my head, but they've lost their sting. What hurts now isn't what she said, but how easily I let myself become someone who deserved to hear them. I liquidated my entire retirement fund to surprise Paige with this anniversary trip to the Bahamas. $23,000 vanished from my 401k to book the overwater bungalow she'd screenshotted and sent me with heart eye emojis 6 months earlier. The same bungalow she'd called goals, and absolutely perfect for us someday. I figured after her brutal months at the consulting firm, pulling 18-hour days and living off energy drinks, we needed this reset. I needed to remind her why we worked. The crystal clear water stretched endlessly from our private deck, and for the first time in months, I watched her genuine smile replace that stressed, hollow look she'd been wearing like armor. We shared expensive cocktails while tropical fish swam beneath our feet, and she actually laughed at my terrible jokes about the resort's overpriced drinks. "This is incredible, Jordan," she said, leaning against me as the sun painted the water gold. "I can't believe you planned all this." That's when I made my first mistake. I mentioned the sacrifice behind the surprise, thinking she'd appreciate knowing how much this meant to me. "I cashed out my retirement to make this happen," I said, expecting gratitude or at least acknowledgement. Instead, her body went rigid against mine. "Why would you tell me that?" she snapped, pulling away like I'd contaminated her perfect moment. "You're guilt-tripping me before we've even been here 24 hours. I tried to explain that I wasn't guilting her, just sharing how important she was to me, but she was already standing up, gathering her designer beach bag with sharp, angry movements. "Your martyrdom complex is exhausting, Jordan. I came here to escape stress, not have more dumped on me." She stormed off toward the resort spa, leaving me alone on our dream deck, watching a $100 cocktail go warm in the island breeze while wondering how expressing love had become emotional manipulation in her eyes. I spent the morning working on my laptop by the infinity pool, trying to catch up on quarterly reports while Paige enjoyed her spa day. That's when Cruz appeared, gliding over to our cabana with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. He looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne advertisement, sun-bleached hair, expensive tattoos covering his arms, and designer board shorts that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "Mind if I join you folks?" he asked, already pulling up a chair without waiting for an answer. "I'm Cruz. You picked the perfect spot here." I introduced myself and mentioned Paige was at the spa, but Cruz wasn't interested in small talk with me. The moment Paige returned, looking relaxed for the first time in months, his entire focus shifted to her like a laser. "You must be the brilliant consultant Jordan's been talking about," he said, flashing a smile that belonged in a dental commercial. "I deal with a lot of consultants in my line of work, cryptocurrency trading, but most of them don't have your obvious intelligence." I watched Paige's professional mask slip as she actually blushed at the compliment. She never blushed when I complimented her intelligence. "What kind of trading do you focus on?" she asked, settling into her lounger with sudden interest. Cruz launched into stories about blockchain ventures and digital nomad adventures that made my accounting work sound like watching paint dry. "Just closed a deal in Singapore last month," he said casually, scrolling through photos on his phone. "Made enough to put a down payment on this yacht I've been eyeing. Freedom to go wherever the market takes me, you know?" I found myself relegated to furniture as Paige hung on every word about his upcoming purchase and his recent deals in Thailand. "That sounds incredible," she said, her voice carrying a wistfulness I hadn't heard in years. "I've always wanted to travel more, but I'm always tied to client deadlines." Cruz moved his chair closer to hers under the pretense of showing her more photos. "Life's too short to let other people's schedules control your dreams," he said, letting his hand brush hers as he handed over his phone. "Smart woman like you should be calling the shots, not taking orders." The way her eyes lit up as she looked at his pictures of pristine beaches and luxury resorts stung more than I wanted to admit, especially since those same eyes had gone dull when I'd shown her photos of our planned museum visits and local restaurants. Cruz became our shadow, materializing at every meal and activity like he'd studied our itinerary. When I suggested we try the resort's famous snorkeling excursion the next morning, Cruz immediately shook his head with practiced disdain. Tourist trap nonsense, he said, waving dismissively at the colorful brochure I'd picked up. My buddy Marcus has this incredible yacht anchored nearby. We could see real marine life, not the picked-over spots they shuttle tourists to. Paige's face lit up with interest she'd never shown for my carefully researched plans. That sounds amazing, she said, already mentally abandoning our scheduled adventure. I watched helplessly as my role shifted from vacation planner to third wheel on my own anniversary trip. At dinner, Cruz regaled us with stories that made my weekend camping trips sound pathetically mundane by comparison. Swimming with whale sharks off the coast of Belize, he said, leaning back in his chair with casual confidence. Nothing compares to looking into the eye of something that massive and ancient. Makes you realize how small your problems really are. He paused dramatically, then launched into tales of cliff diving in Croatia and racing motorcycles through the mountains of Peru. Jordan likes camping too, Paige offered weakly, but even she seemed embarrassed by how domestic and safe my adventures sounded next to Cruz's stories. Local state parks mostly, I added, feeling foolish. Nothing too exotic. Cruz smiled with what might have been pity. Everyone starts somewhere, man. The key is pushing your boundaries, you know? Living intentionally instead of just existing. The implicit criticism hung in the air like smoke, and I watched Paige absorb every word like gospel. When I mentioned our planned visit to the island's historical museum, she actually rolled her eyes. God, Jordan, we're in paradise and you want to look at dusty artifacts? The public humiliation stung, but what hurt more was seeing her look at me like I was holding her back from experiencing real life. The breaking point came when I suggested we have one evening alone together, just the two of us like we'd originally planned. That's incredibly possessive, Paige snapped, her voice carrying a sharp edge I'd never heard directed at me before. We're on vacation, not in some controlling relationship bubble. Cruz watched our argument with barely concealed satisfaction, occasionally nodding as if her criticism of my character was perfectly reasonable. Some people just have different comfort zones, he said with a philosophical shrug that somehow made my desire for couple times seem pathological. That night, Paige chose Cruz's exclusive beach party over the romantic sunset dinner I'd carefully arranged through the concierge, leaving me to eat alone while watching her dance around a bonfire in the distance, her laughter carrying across the water like a knife twisting in my chest. I waited on our bungalow deck until 3 a.m., watching the empty beach and fighting the growing certainty of what was happening. The bonfire had died hours ago, but Paige still hadn't returned, and my calls went straight to voicemail. When she finally appeared, she was barefoot and disheveled, her hair tangled with ocean salt and carrying the scent of unfamiliar cologne that definitely wasn't mine. She didn't attempt to lie or offer explanations, just stood at the deck railing staring out at the water like she was gathering courage for what came next. Jordan, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice clinically detached. Being with Cruz tonight made me realize something I've been denying for months. The words hit me like physical blows, but I kept my voice steady. Are you sure about whatever you're about to say? She turned to face me then, and I saw a stranger wearing my girlfriend's face. I feel alive with him in a way I haven't felt in years. Going back to our old life would be like choosing death over living. I absorbed her verdict without flinching, even though something fundamental was cracking inside my chest. So what happens now? I asked. I'm leaving with him tomorrow. He's offered to show me what real adventure looks like. She paused, maybe expecting me to fight or beg. I'm sorry, Jordan. You're a good man, but you're not enough anymore. I quietly packed my belongings while she showered off another man's touch, booked the earliest flight home, and left her sleeping in the bed we'd once shared, dreaming of her new life with a stranger who'd known her for 3 days. The flight home gave me 12 hours to think, and by the time I landed, I knew exactly what needed to happen. I called my brother Mason from the airport. He's a lawyer, the type who handles messy divorces and custody battles with surgical precision. I need your help, I told him simply. Paige cheated and left me in the Bahamas. I want her completely out of my life before she gets back. Mason didn't ask for details, just met me at my apartment with a locksmith and a moving crew. Within 6 hours, every lock was changed, our joint savings account was transferred to my name only, and Paige's belongings were professionally packed and moved to a storage unit across town. I kept the receipts for everything, knowing she'd probably try to claim I'd stolen or damaged her stuff. The apartment felt hollow without her presence, but I didn't want her energy lingering in my space anymore. I took a week off work and completely transformed what had been our shared home into something unrecognizably mine. New furniture replaced the pieces she'd insisted on buying, artwork she'd hated went up on the walls, and I painted an accent wall in deep blue that she would have called aggressive and masculine. Every trace of our shared aesthetic disappeared, the throw pillows she'd strategically placed, the scented candles that gave her good energy, the motivational quotes she'd hung in the bathroom. I replaced them with things that actually reflected my personality, vintage movie posters, my grandfather's old leather armchair that she'd banished to the spare room, and actual books instead of the coffee table photography volumes she'd bought for appearance. The silence that used to feel oppressive when she was critiquing every aspect of my personality now became my sanctuary. I blocked her on every social media platform, changed my Netflix password, canceled the premium Spotify account she'd been using, and informed our mutual friends that I didn't want updates about her situation. Don't tell me where she is, who she's with, or how she's doing, I told our friend group in a simple group text. I'm moving forward, and that means not looking back. Most of them respected my boundaries, though a few tried to play mediator until I made it clear that anyone feeding me information about Paige would be cut off too. I created an information firewall around my new life, and it felt like finally being able to breathe without someone monitoring my every exhale. The week of radio silence was blissful. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat instead of the organic, Instagram-worthy plates she'd insisted on because presentation matters. I watched action movies without commentary about toxic masculinity, played music she'd called noise, and left dishes in the sink overnight without someone sighing dramatically about living like animals. I bought a new coffee maker that actually made good coffee instead of the expensive espresso machine she'd wanted for photos, and I ate cereal for dinner without anyone lecturing me about nutrition. For the first time in years, my home felt like mine, not a museum curated for someone else's approval. I even rearranged the furniture to face the windows instead of the TV, something she'd always vetoed because it disrupted the flow. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, Cruz had already grown bored with his newest conquest and moved on to fresher prey, leaving Paige stranded and financially devastated in paradise. Turns out cryptocurrency traders who live on yachts aren't really looking for long-term commitment, especially with women who abandon their stable relationships on a whim. She'd burned her bridges for a fantasy that lasted exactly 4 days before Cruz sailed off to his next adventure, taking her credit cards and passport with him as some kind of twisted souvenir. The man who'd promised her a life of endless adventure had left her with nothing but hotel bills she couldn't pay and a growing understanding of how thoroughly she'd destroyed her safety net. According to what I later learned through Mason's investigation, she'd spent 2 days crying in a Nassau police station trying to report her cards stolen, only to discover that she'd willingly given them to Cruz and had no legal recourse. My methodical approach to severing all connections proved prophetic when Paige attempted to return a week later, only to find herself legally and practically locked out of the life she'd abandoned. Mason handled all communication through his law office, ensuring I never had to hear her voice or read her increasingly desperate messages directly. "She's trying every angle," he reported during one of our weekly check-ins. Claiming abandonment, emotional abuse, theft of jointly owned property. "I've documented everything, and she doesn't have a legal leg to stand on." The beautiful thing about dating someone for 3 years without getting married or buying property together is how cleanly you can separate when it's over. No shared debts, no custody arrangements, no legal obligations beyond basic human decency, which she'd already forfeited when she chose to humiliate me in public and cheat with a stranger. I felt no guilt about protecting myself from someone who'd demonstrated such casual cruelty. Mason even helped me draft a formal cease and desist letter, making it clear that any further contact attempts would result in harassment charges. "You're being smart about this," he told me. "Most guys in your situation try to be the bigger person and end up getting manipulated for months." The transformation wasn't just practical, It was psychological. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around someone else's moods or second-guessing my own preferences. I bought groceries I actually wanted to eat, watched movies she'd called boring, and rediscovered hobbies she'd subtly discouraged because they took attention away from her. I started reading again, picked up my guitar for the first time in 2 years, and even signed up for a pottery class because it sounded interesting and I didn't have to justify my choices to anyone. The peace that settled over my life was profound and immediate, like finally taking off shoes that had been too tight for years. I began sleeping through the night without her tossing and turning, complaining about my breathing or the temperature or whatever minor thing was bothering her that day. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes, stopped worrying about saying the wrong thing, stopped performing the exhausting dance of trying to keep someone happy who was determined to be miserable. The man in the mirror looked different too, less tense, less apologetic for existing. I started standing straighter, speaking with more confidence, making decisions without consulting an imaginary critic who would never be satisfied anyway. Paige's first frantic phone call came from a Nassau airport payphone 3 days after I'd returned, her voice shrill with disbelief and rage as she demanded to know why her key didn't work and where her belongings were. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted it without listening to the full message, catching only fragments about cruel and illegal and how could you. The calls multiplied from different numbers as she grew more desperate, each one angrier than the last. Her best friend Monica became her advocate, calling me with a voice heavy with manufactured sympathy to explain that Cruz had disappeared with Paige's credit cards and passport, leaving her stranded and broke in a foreign country. She's sleeping in a hostel, Jordan, Monica said, like this was somehow my responsibility to fix. She has no money, no way to get home. Whatever happened between you two, surely you can't just abandon her like this. My response was ice-cold professionalism that surprised even me. I'm directing all communication through my lawyer, Mason Henderson at Henderson Legal. Any further calls to my personal number will be documented as harassment. Monica sputtered about my heartlessness, but I hung up and immediately blocked her number too. I was learning that boundaries only work if you enforce them consistently. The text messages that followed revealed Paige's complete emotional unraveling, a progression from entitled demands to tearful confessions that read like stages of grief. You can't just leave me here. I need to come home and we need to talk like adults. Then, I made a mistake. People make mistakes. You're being incredibly cruel. Then, I'm staying in a place with roaches, Jordan. Actual roaches. Please just let me come home temporarily until I figure things out. Each message showed photos designed to manipulate, her crying in a dingy bathroom mirror, a cockroach on a wall, a bed that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. She was clearly documenting her suffering, thinking it would guilt me into rescuing her. I read each message with detached curiosity, noting how she never actually apologized for cheating, only for the consequences she was now facing. There was no acknowledgement of how she'd humiliated me, no recognition of the cruelty of abandoning me on what was supposed to be our anniversary trip. Just demands that I fix the mess she'd created by making impulsive decisions with a stranger. Remember when you said you'd always be there for me? One message read. I know I hurt you, but this isn't who you are. The Jordan I know wouldn't leave someone stranded like this. The audacity was breathtaking. She'd literally left me stranded on a tropical island to run off with another man, but somehow I was the villain for not funding her rescue mission. When she finally managed to call from Monica's phone, sobbing about how cruel and heartless I'd become, I delivered a final message through Mason's office. Any further contact would result in a restraining order. The legal language seemed to finally penetrate her desperation, because the calls stopped abruptly. I later learned she'd borrowed money from her parents to fly home, burning that bridge by lying about why she needed emergency funds and where she'd been for the past week. 3 months later, I had rebuilt my life completely and it was unrecognizable from the version Paige had criticized into submission. I'd moved to a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights, got promoted to senior accountant after taking initiative on several high-profile audits, and was casually seeing Rebecca, a confident architect who appreciated my stability without calling it boring. Rebecca was everything Paige wasn't, genuinely interested in my work, supportive of my goals, and secure enough in herself that she didn't need constant validation or expensive gestures to feel valued. She brought her own wine to dinner dates and insisted we split checks because equality matters in real relationships. The ghost of my past materialized in my building's parking garage one evening as I was loading groceries into my car, where Paige ambushed me looking haggard and desperate. Her designer clothes had been replaced with thrift store finds, her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been sleeping poorly for months. "Jordan, please, just give me 5 minutes to explain," she said, stepping out from behind a pillar like she'd been waiting for hours. "I know you probably hate me, but I need you to hear me out." I continued loading groceries with deliberate calm, not acknowledging her presence until she physically stepped in front of my car. She launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about how Cruz's betrayal had made her realize I was her real soulmate, and how we could build something stronger from the ashes of our relationship. "I was confused and scared about how serious things were getting with us," she said, tears streaming down her face in a performance I'd seen too many times before. Cruz represented this fantasy of freedom, but it was all lies. He used me and threw me away like garbage. "You were real, Jordan. What we had was real, and I destroyed it because I was too immature to see what was right in front of me." I listened without emotion, noting how even her apology centered entirely on her own suffering rather than the pain she'd caused me. She never mentioned the humiliation of being abandoned on our anniversary trip, never acknowledged the cruelty of leaving me for a stranger she'd known for 3 days, never addressed how she'd systematically torn down my confidence while building up Cruz as everything I wasn't. When she finished her rehearsed plea, I delivered a response that destroyed her last shred of hope with surgical precision. "Paige, the man you're talking to doesn't exist anymore," I said, my voice steady and final. "You're apologizing to someone who died in that hotel room when you chose a stranger over 3 years of commitment. The person standing here now values himself too highly to accept scraps from your table." Her face crumpled as the words hit their target. "That's not fair. People change, people grow. I've learned from my mistakes." "You didn't make mistakes," I continued, feeling the truth of each word as I spoke it. "You made choices. Calculated decisions based on what you thought would make you happier. The only thing you regret is that those choices had consequences you didn't anticipate." She tried one more desperate angle, reaching out to touch my arm. "I love you, Jordan. I know I hurt you, but doesn't that mean anything? Doesn't 3 years together mean anything?" I stepped back from her touch like it might contaminate me. 3 years meant everything to me once. But you taught me that love without respect is just attachment, and I'm not attached to people who treat me like a backup plan. As I drove away, leaving her alone in the empty garage, I felt not triumph but profound peace. In my rearview mirror, I watched her small figure receding into the distance, a reminder of a life I'd never return to. The man she'd found had unshakable boundaries and zero tolerance for manipulation, and she'd lost access not just to a relationship but to the confident, self-assured person I'd become. Rebecca was waiting at my condo with takeout and genuine interest in how my day had gone, representing everything I'd learned to value: consistency, respect, and partnership between equals.